Welcome everyone to the June webinar of the joint webinar series Topics at the Nexus of Climate Change, Fisheries, and Blue Foods. My name is Laura Anderson. I'm the Engagement Project Manager at the Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions and support the UN Decade Blue Food Futures Program, which focuses on the role of fisheries and aquaculture in global food systems. This webinar series is co-hosted by 4 UN Ocean Decade programs: Blue Food Futures, FishSCORE, Supreme, and SmartNet. And so before we start with the presentations, I'll let my colleagues and other co-hosts introduce themselves and the programs now before we turn to the topic of today's webinar, monitoring and modeling ocean ecosystem changes. So I'll start with Claire to introduce FishSCORE.
Thanks, Laura. I'm Claire Enterline, and I'm based at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. I'm the coordinator for the FishSCORE UN Ocean Decade Program, which stands for Fisheries Strategies for Changing Oceans and Resilient Ecosystems. And FishSCORE facilitates an international network of partners to develop information, tools, and resources to support climate resilience in fisheries and fishing communities, and also provide a forum for exchange of experiences, research, and to develop new collaborations. And I will turn it over to Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. So I'm representing actually 2 of the programs today. So first one is SmartNet. So that's sustainability of marine ecosystems through global knowledge networks. And so that's a program that's sponsored by ICES and Pisces, which are 2 leading intergovernmental marine science organizations. And the goal of SmartNet is to leverage the infrastructure and partnerships and long-term collaborations between ICES and Pisces to build a global knowledge network to share knowledge and capacity around themes of climate impacts and sustainability of marine ecosystems. And then the other program is Supreme. Our coordinator, Grace Ruskar, couldn't make it today, but that stands for Sustainability, Predictability, and Resilience of Marine Ecosystems. So this is a NOAA-sponsored decade program. And we're aiming to, again, convene global partners through knowledge networks and share information and develop climate-ready infrastructure to support climate-ready ecosystem-based fisheries management in a changing climate. Thanks. I'll turn it back over to Laura.
Great, thanks. So we're very excited to have 2 great presentations for this month's webinar. The first one is on the Olympic Region Harmful Algal Bloom Partnership, presented by Dr. Vera Trainer, who's the Marine Program Director and Research Scientist with the Olympic Natural Resources Center, and in her role, she directs this partnership. And the second presentation will be on future seas, but with Dr. Barb Mulling, who is a research scientist at the University of California, Santa Cruz, based at the NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center. And so I'll let Vera take it away, and we should have time for questions after each presentation and then at the end of the session as well. So if you have questions that you want to drop in the chat while the presentations are happening, please do so. And then we'll also have some opportunity for discussion after each of the presentations. So Dr. Trainer, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, and good morning. I'm talking to you from Seattle, Washington, or good day if you're in another part of the world. I want to talk to you about a partnership that was established almost 25 years ago now, and resides not so far from where I'm living here in Seattle. It's a ferry ride and a beautiful drive across the Olympic Peninsula to the outer coast of Washington, the Pacific coast of Washington, where we often have problems with harmful algal blooms. And this partnership is, it consists of a number of the coastal tribes, the Makah, the Quinault, the Quileute, and the Hoh, as well as state partners and federal partners. Let's see if I can get this to shift. Okay, so first I wanted to start with this. The basis of the partnership is monitoring of phytoplankton, which produce over half of the world's oxygen. So every second breath that you take is thanks to the phytoplankton. So many of these microscopic marine organisms are beneficial to us, in fact, help sustain us. But a very small proportion of them can cause harmful algal blooms. And just as a bit of a review, these toxic algae can produce poisons, which when concentrated in shellfish and then consumed by humans can cause a suite of toxic syndromes within people. For example, paralytic shellfish poisoning, which over 30 people in Oregon just suffered from gathering recreational shellfish. And I'll get into that a little bit more later. So these are a number of the foodborne harmful algal bloom related illnesses. And I'm just going to focus on a couple of them today. The amnesic shellfish poisoning, which results from domoic acid, a poison that is produced by the compound Pseudonychia, and the paralytic shellfish poisoning, the main toxin form of which is saxitoxin, which is produced by several of the genera of phytoplankton, the most common of which is Alexandrium in our area. Let's see. So these harmful algal blooms, I mean, in fact, the one that just occurred in the Pacific Northwest coast, now the paralytic shellfish toxins, these are now linked in some way to these extreme weather events that are increasing. So increased rainfall can lead to nutrient loading. Drought can lead to freshwater input or less freshwater input, which then may lead to stratification, which is going to favor the flagellates. And then shifting currents can transport some of the offshore phytoplankton populations towards shore. And in fact, we are seeing a number of extreme ocean events around the world that are in fact contributing to some of these extreme harmful algal blooms. And I've noted here in the left corner the Pseudonychia event that occurred in 2015. And you see in the image below that the Pacific Ocean became a cauldron. It was the year of extreme drought. And then we've had very extreme events in Chile due to both Alexandrium and Pseudo-Chatanella, excuse me, that have resulted in massive fish kills. So Chile is one of the largest producers of aquacultured salmons. So these harmful algal blooms have affected those populations. And then in Tasmania, we've seen some Alexandrium events that have appeared to come out of the blue, which we think are due to the cyst populations coming to the surface as a result of changing currents and changing weather events. So let's come back now to the Pacific Northwest, the domoic acid event in 2015, which affected a number of species, and not only humans were affected, but you can see that there are a number of marine mammal species that were affected in that year due to some of these toxins. And the numbers next to the organisms or below the organisms on the right-hand panel show the numbers of marine mammals that we know were affected by these harmful algal blooms, but in fact, a huge number more were likely affected. Razor clam harvests up here in the Pacific Northwest, particularly in Washington, where the tribes, they depend on these shellfish for subsistence, but also for income. And then there are a number of recreational harvesters who come to the beach that was entirely closed for a year. And then the Dungeness crab harvest was affected. So we estimate that there was about $1 million loss to the Dungeness crab fishery in that year. And we look at the records, and domoic acid appears to be linked to warmer water events. And I've also listed here that the copepod anomaly is also associated with warmer water events. So as we see waters continue to warm, these events are more than likely going to continue to have this extreme influence on our fisheries. And I wanted to mention this paralytic shellfish poisoning event in a little more detail. Here are a couple of the news stories. These were recreational harvesters who went to the beaches. Now it's over 31 people who were sick, who became sick. A couple were hospitalized. But what I want to point to is the fact that Oregon was in a hiatus where its phytoplankton monitoring person was going to start on June 17th. And there was nobody looking in the water at the time that this poisoning event occurred. So it really illustrates the importance of consistent weekly phytoplankton monitoring. So this is the method that we use in Oregon, in Washington and in Oregon, where on the left you see the regulatory method, where we have our Fish and Wildlife departments providing clams to be tested for the toxins by our health departments. In Washington, it's the Washington State Department of Health, and in Oregon, it's the Oregon Department of Agriculture. But by collecting plankton, looking for harmful algal blooms, and testing the seawater for toxins, we can provide an early warning of toxins that are potentially in the water and in the shellfish. This does not replace the standard regulatory methods, but allows our health departments to prioritize samples and to know when these urgent emergency events are occurring. So here is a map of all of the partners associated with ORHAB. I did mention that they're the 4 coastal tribes. The Macaw, the Quileute, the Quinault, and the Hoh are just above the Quinault tribe there near Claylock Beach. We have the Olympic Natural Resource Center, which is a branch of University of Washington, which is where I'm now located. And they lead the ORHAB partnership. The Department of Fish and Wildlife is there in the south, and you see all of the beaches that are monitored are shown in the brown italics. So we have really a comprehensive picture of what is happening up and down the coast. We have the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Health that are in Seattle. So you see how far samples have to travel in order to have shellfish tested for toxins. So by providing the early warning, by having these eyes on the coast, which are the tribes and the state entities, we really are able to help the health department prioritize samples. And we have these groups of people that I'm showing on the right: Washington, Oregon, Alaska. These are groups that have been trained on the methods that were initially developed by ORHAB, and in fact, through Pisces, the North Pacific Marine Science Organization, we've taken some of these methods to other parts of the world, to the Philippines, to Guatemala, and so on. So we have the ORHAB partnership on the outer coast, which was established 25 years ago. And about 15 years ago, we brought this program into Puget Sound, which you see in the inset. And this partnership is called Sound Toxins. So we have a vision of developing a statewide program that will share data, will share information with not only the health department, but with one another. And Puget Sound has a huge shellfish, commercial shellfish industry. So this is particularly important for that. But there is also recreational harvest in Puget Sound. So this is the mapping system that was initially established through the Puget Sound Partnership, the Sound Toxins Partnership. And what this is the phytoplankton data that is then translated into a traffic light pattern. So you see the purple on the left there, and that site is Squim Bay. So the Department of Health can look at this map, and this was actually requested by them, and determine that, there is a high number of Alexandrium in Squim Bay at this site. So we need to collect some extra shellfish samples from this site. So it's sort of a one-stop shopping where the managers and the participants can look at the data and say, we have a problem in our area, or we're green, we're good to go. So this is the synthesis of all of the data that's come together with the ORHAB partnership as the cornerstone. So we have the toxin and cell monitoring at the coast. We also have some offshore boat sampling at some of the toxin hotspots. And you see on the right there, the Juan de Fuca Eddy and Hecate Bank. These were two sites that were determined from cruises in the late 90s, 1997, 1998. We determined that these are initiation sites for the harmful algal blooms that make their way to the coast. So we are, when we can, we have offshore boat sampling at these sites, and I'll be talking about an exciting new addition that's coming into our waters in the next couple slides. So there's this synthesis of all of the data that come together into a Pacific Northwest HAB bulletin that is released to both Oregon and Washington managers prior to razor clam digs. And you can see the testimonial from Matt Hunter, who's the shellfish manager in Oregon. He said, the Long Beach, Washington razor clam opening and increased limit was a boon for the Oregon North Coast economies. Astoria businesses sold a lot of digging equipment. A lot of people were hungry for clams. So that's after there was a closure in Oregon. The bulletin said, we have a green light, we're ready to go. The managers decided to increase the numbers of clams that folks could harvest, largely due to this synthesis of information provided by the Pacific Northwest HAB bulletin. So here I want to mention, and I've talked about the 4 coastal tribes that are a part of our partnership. And I also talked to you about the initiation sites for harmful algal blooms, including the Juan de Fuca Eddy. So you can see here an image, a satellite temperature image, showing this very cold water in the Juan de Fuca Eddy, indicating that there's upwelling at this site. Well, the macaw have known for many years that this is a productive site where they can go fishing, and also whaling is common in this area. And so by listening to the stories from the tribes, from our partners, we can really gain knowledge. And if we'd listened to them a little more closely, we would have known that this is a hotspot site. This is where the plankton are abundant. So by having them as partners in our project, in our partnership, we're able to then gain this knowledge that has been available for centuries. I wanted to show also that we're collaborating in the bulletin with the University of Washington. Here's the live ocean model that shows particles that are being released from these 2 initiation sites, the Juan de Fuca Eddy and Hecate Bank, showing the likelihood of these particles traveling to the coast. So we're becoming more and more advanced in our ability to predict whether particles are going to come to the coast, whether we're going to have a harmful algal bloom. And this is the exciting new addition to the partnership, where we're going to have this surface autonomous vehicle that's going to be deployed to both the Hecate Bank hotspot site and the Juan de Fuca Eddy hotspot site. It is a solar-powered vehicle that will be able to collect both filters and water for samples. And these samples will then be analyzed at the tribal labs or at the University of Washington. So our first deployment is happening in Newport, Oregon at the end of July. So this whole approach for the partnership, I really like the word that the Japanese use, sataumi, where it's a village sea approach. It's a collaboration and it's a recognition of the importance of the sea and the humans at the sea. And I think the basis of the ORHAB partnership is that we share our knowledge, including local knowledge. We have monthly meetings where we really listen to the concerns of the coastal community. We foster this collaborative and equitable relationship from the beginning of an idea. So this idea of establishing the ORHAB partnership didn't come from me. It came from a survey of the coastal community where they said, harmful algal blooms are important. We need more science. So they were included in the partnership from the beginning. We conduct science as a collective action, and I would say we have great mutual respect of one another. So thank you to all the partners who have funded us over the years, and to all the folks who are doing the legwork on the ground on the coast. And thanks to you for listening.
Thank you so much, Vera. We have time for some questions before we turn to the second presentation. If anyone has questions at this stage about the partnership and some of the work that Vera and other collaborators have been doing. If no one has one, I had a question. I'm curious, you mentioned sort of through partnerships collaborating on some of these methods in other geographies and other countries. And I'm curious if you could speak a bit more about sort of that process of collaboration, how are they established, and kind of what types of structures need to be first established to set up monitoring like these in new locations, new geographies.
Yeah, it's actually simple equipment that's needed. In fact, Pisces has been working with these fold scopes that can be attached to even your cell phone camera. We often get a comment or maybe a complaint that this phytoplankton monitoring can't replace regulatory monitoring. And we say, you know, that is okay. We just need more eyes on the coast, in particular, to see, you know, what might be coming due to climate change. So we like to work together with the regulatory groups to then add this phytoplankton monitoring that just gives an additional feeling of confidence that people know what's in the water. So in the Philippines, you know, we did our work there. They already had their microscopes. They already had great knowledge in phytoplankton identification, but we helped them mostly in understanding how to use the data, how to use the early warning to inform their standard regulatory sampling. And they have such a huge coastline. So I think it was really helpful to bring others into the partnership. It's interesting. Other countries don't always have volunteers helping with the microscopies. So I think they're starting to warm up to that, to the fact that, look, you can use relative abundance. You don't need exact counts. You don't need exact data to provide an early warning. And so, yeah, through conversation, through planting these ideas, I think we've been able to help set up advanced programs for harmful algal bloom early warning.
Thank you for that. There looks to be another question in the chat as well from Holly, and Holly, I'm happy to read it out, and then feel free to jump in if there's additional context. But would you be willing to tell us more about the tribal labs? Yeah. What kinds of capacity do they have?
Yeah, that's actually great. So the tribe said, we want to do this toxin testing. Back when I was with NOAA, we would do all of the analysis at the NOAA lab. And they said, we want to learn this. And so we've brought them, we've been able to purchase through grants and through ORHAB funding, which now has transitioned to the state. And every license fee, shellfish license fee purchased in Washington state, $1 to $3 goes toward funding the ORHAB partnership. So the tribes have plate readers, they have plate washers, they have fantastic microscopes, many of which have fluorescent capabilities. The Macaw tribe has big problems with paralytic shellfish toxins, so they have a you know, a hot water bath, they have vortex mixers, we're giving them what they need to be able to do these analyses on their own. We provide training and we provide, you know, all the supplies. So they are full-on research labs.
No, that is interesting, the kind of the shellfish or, you know, allowances and having some of the funding go towards the monitoring systems to kind of help to maintain the health of these shellfish. I guess we can turn it over. If anyone has other questions for Vera, please drop them in the chat and we'll have some time at the end of both presentations to have questions for both of our presenters. But I want to turn it over to Barb Mulling, who will be presenting on Future Seas and that project.
Thanks, Laura. Let me share my screen. Does that look okay?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I'm just going to give you a really quick presentation today on the Future Seas project. It's on behalf of many other people, including my co-PIs, who I've listed at the bottom of the slide here. So Future Seas is basically a collaborative effort to look at the potential impacts of climate change on West Coast fisheries and also to evaluate strategies for managing those impacts. We're primarily focused on ocean fisheries for highly migratory coastal pelagic and groundfish species off the West Coast, so that is to say not anadromous species. And we're a group of scientists with really broad expertise ranging from physical oceanography to ecology up through economists and social scientists. And the project was funded by the NOAA Climate Program Office. We're focused on the California current system, which most of you are very familiar with. But our main reason for focusing on the system as a whole is that it is highly productive, it provides many ecosystem services, and we're particularly interested in the role of these smaller forage species in transferring energy from plankton to upper trophic levels, which includes protected species and targeted fishery species. Future Seas started with phase 1 in 2017. And it, I think, was one of the earliest projects that really tried to take this physics to fisheries framework. So we combined downscaled global climate models with a suite of different ecological models focused on Pacific sardine, albacore, and swordfish. And we did management strategy evaluations, or MSEs, for each of these 3 species, and then tied these to some simple socioeconomic models. So the important thing to note here is that even though we had sort of a physics to fisheries flow in this project, it ultimately had a single species focus. And rather than try and encompass everything that we did in the 4 years of this project, I'm just going to show you some edited highlights. So starting at the bottom with the oceanography, as I mentioned, we had these dynamically downscaled projections of future conditions in the California current, approximately covering the US EEZ and offshore. We used 3 different Earth system models from GFDL, IPSL, and the Hadley Center, which we just refer to by their institution names for short. And for example, I've shown here from the publication describing these models, the level of warming that we expect by the end of the century from each of these models under RCP 8.5. You can see that the warming is weakest in the GFDL model and strongest in the Hadley model. And based on these projections, for example, one of the things we can start to do is to look at novelty in the ocean conditions. Where and when do we start to see conditions that we haven't seen before in that location, that we haven't seen before in that season, or that we just haven't seen before in the California current full stop? And that's what this paper by James Smith did at the bottom. And you can see those increasing areas of red and orange are where conditions are, by the end of the century, getting really novel for the system as a whole. So we're moving into uncharted territory. In terms of the ecology, we had a couple of different models focusing on Pacific sardine. The study at the top used what's called a model of intermediate complexity, or MICE, to try and pin down the drivers of recruitment and population size in sardine in terms of, for example, the impacts of food availability and temperature on early life stages. And then Stefan projected these forwards in time using those same 3 Earth system models. And you can see that although there's a lot of variability in time, in general, his models suggest an increase in sardine biomass under all 3 Earth system models. A different approach was taken by some collaborators at UCSC, led by Jerome Fichter. They have quite a complex individual-based model, which simulates the life history and movement of sardine and anchovy as well in the California current. The outputs of this model are very complex, but for example, you can see here that they project a northward shift in the distribution of sardine by the end of the century. And we then started to think about what this might mean for fisheries. This paper at the top looked at the impact of sardine distribution shifts on landings at 3 historically important ports at Westport, Moss Landing, and San Pedro. And you can see that, as you might expect, we project a decline in landings at the southern ports and an increase in landings at the northern ports. But the magnitudes of these shifts do depend on the Earth system model that you look at, which highlights that it is important to include multiple climate models when you do these projections. And the figure at the bottom shows that for albacore, somewhat in contrast to sardine, we see a slight northward shift in projected CPUE from the surface trawl fishery. But what was really striking is we started to see this inshore shift in habitat. As the offshore waters get warmer and more oligotrophic, those sort of frontal boundary waters at albacore lake start to become smooshed up against the coast. And then lastly, on top of this, we had a couple of different studies looking at socioeconomics. One really nice one by Tim Frawley at the top looked at networks of how fishermen switch in and out of different fisheries. This shows a network from the recent past. And this is for fishers who at some point participate in the albacore trawl fishery. So for example, you can see that these fishermen also have strong ties to the Chinook trawl fishery and the Dungeness crab pot fishery. And Tim also did some really interesting interviews with some of the fishers, and I've just shown a couple of quotes here. And you can see that they're very cognizant of the changes that are going on both in the environment, the ecology, and also the markets that they rely on. And at the bottom here, I've shown a bit of a more complex study from James Smith again, and he looked at the economic utility of the drift gillnet fishery in terms of closed areas. At the moment, a lot of the coast is closed off to the drift gillnet fishery to protect sea turtles. And James looked at a couple of different ways of making these closures dynamic. And importantly, he showed that if you adopt these management procedures, as we move forwards in time and as ocean conditions become more novel, the effectiveness of these closed areas, whether they are dynamic or fixed, can actually change. Okay, so that was Future Seas 1. We're now into Future Seas 2, and that started in 2020 and it is wrapping up this year. So this project has a pretty similar structure to Future Seas 1. We're relying on those same downscale projections. The biggest change here is that we started collaborating with some folks at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center in Seattle to use their Atlantis model, which is a model of the whole ecosystem from physics to ecology to predator-prey relationships, all the way up to fisheries and management. We looked a little bit more into the economics in Future Seas 2, which I'll show you a little bit in a minute. And we use management strategy evaluation to try and identify climate robust management procedures given the changes we expect in the ecosystem. A lot of the work is just getting submitted for publication, but we have some results in prep that I can highlight here. One of the major achievements of this project was that Pierre-Yves Hernvan and a few other folks rebuilt the West Coast Atlantis model. They included new information, for example, on predator-prey dynamics and species distributions. And Atlantis includes all of the aspects that you can see at the right of that plot. Like, it really is a model of just about everything. It's a monster. And one of the things that we did was we took our simple species distribution models for species like sardine and anchovy, as well as some highly migratory species and protected species, and actually used those to inform how species biomass moves between boxes in Atlantis. And those boxes are shown at the right. So that was a big job, but we think it substantially improved the ability of Atlantis to show spatial distribution of biomass. And now we have Atlantis all set up, we can start to do some interesting things with it. This paper, which I think is just about to be submitted, led by Owen Liu, is looking at projecting future landings by species using outputs from Atlantis, but also what we call the footprints of different fishing fleets. And one of his example results here looks at coastal pelagic species for a number of different ports. And you can see that he projects an increase in future sardine landings, but a decrease in future landings of anchovy and squid. And because we're starting to generate a lot of different models, something we're also doing is looking at model ensembles. So that would sort of be like, you might be familiar with, for example, people use ensembles of weather models or climate models. And here we're looking into using ensembles of ecological models. And this is some preliminary results from this paper. The rather messy figure you can see at the right is projections of sardine landings from 3 very different types of models, and then an ensemble in purple. So by doing this, we can start to learn where the models differ and then start to pin down why they differ and try and highlight areas that we need to learn more about in terms of ecology or fisheries. Our economist on the project, Felipe Casada, did some really nice work looking at fleet segments. And so he took records of landings for all vessels that have landed CPS, that is sardine, anchovy, and market squid, and tried to cluster them into groups depending on the species that they targeted, but also how they responded to change. For example, once the sardine fishery was closed in 2015, did these fishers switch to target another species? Did they just stop fishing? Things like that. And so that sort of helps us look at discrete groups in terms of the fishery and think about how they might respond to future change, rather than just treating any boat that lands sardine as a monolith. And lastly, Robert Wildermuth has been doing a lot of work on management strategy evaluation, which is where you essentially try to simulate a truth and then assess your ability to estimate what's actually going on in the system. And here I've shown a couple of different candidate harvest control rules, or HCRs, for sardine that Robert's been assessing the effectiveness of, both for present day conditions and also for future climate change. And this was just published last year. Again, to wrap up, we are now into Future Seas 3, which just started a few months ago. Our project structure is pretty similar to Future Seas 2. We are trying to target our deliverables more to both the Pacific Fishery Management Council, as well as the new Climate, Ecosystems and Fisheries Initiative at NOAA that many of you are probably familiar with. Future Seas is now considered as a pilot project for CEFI, meaning that we can inform their broader effort, but also that we can leverage some of their tools, like, for example, new coast-wide projections that we might have struggled to get done by ourselves. We don't have a lot of results yet, but just in terms of some key updates that we're excited about. As I mentioned, our initial dynamical downscaling only really covered the US EEZ. And that's actually a bit smaller than the footprint of the Atlantis model, which was a bit of a challenge for trying to incorporate projections and models. So we're now going to focus on something approximating the yellow area, so we can start to get more into the Gulf of Alaska and also include some of Baja California as well. And that will also let us start to look at perhaps transboundary effects for some species and fisheries, which we weren't really able to do before. We're broadening the species we're considering. Remember, in Future Seas 1, we just had 3 species. In Future Seas 2, we were thinking mostly about the CPS or forage complex. And we're sort of integrating some existing work and people who work on protected species and also on groundfish, and basically trying to bring all of that into one project. We're really excited to do some more social science in Future Seas 3. That hasn't been a strength I think, up to now. So, for example, we have some great folks at the Northwest Fisheries Science Centre and elsewhere who look at how you define fishing communities. For example, in terms of how they fish, where they fish, and the communities that they belong to. And lastly, we're moving our management strategy evaluation from considering primarily one species at a time to considering the ecosystem as a whole. And that, again, will be bringing in outputs from the Atlantis model. Okay, so a couple of, I guess, general findings we have so far. In terms of shifting habitats and shifting species, I think we've shown that these can impact fisheries, for example, bycatch, transboundary management, but perhaps other aspects that we don't think about so much, such as survey planning on NOAA ships. And when stocks change productivity, that can also impact our stock assessment and management effectiveness, as well as the dynamics of the ecosystem and also the vulnerability and climate readiness of fisheries communities. Some of our specific lessons learned, I think, that we didn't really expect coming into these projects. The first one sounds obvious, that you need to tailor your modelling framework to the specific context, but when you have, for example, oceanographers talking to ecologists and economists, their idea of a suitable model can actually differ quite markedly. Something that we spent a lot of time on was trying to show that our models could replicate the past before projecting them forwards. And I think that's pretty important for gaining the confidence of stakeholders, for example. It's not much use saying you can project the future if you really can't replicate the past. It's not new to say that we really need to communicate uncertainty. I think that's an ongoing challenge when it comes to talking about climate change with stakeholders. We need to engage them often. And it sounds obvious to say that multidisciplinary teams are necessary, but we really found, for example, that it's too much to expect one person to really understand everything from physics through to socioeconomics. You need a good team and a team that can communicate effectively. That's all I have for you. Thank you very much for listening. All of the publications I mentioned are on our website, which is in a bit of a need of an update, but they are all posted there. So thank you very much for your attention.